Good evening, everybody. I'm Gavriel Rosenfeld, president here at the Center for Jewish History, and I'm excited to welcome you all to this evening's event. For those of you who are here for the first time, the Center for Jewish History is home to the largest archive of Jewish historical source material outside of Israel. The center is comprised of 5 partner institutions: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And together their holdings comprise more than 65 million documents, including the second largest Holocaust archive outside of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The center, however, is more than just an archive devoted to preserving the Jewish past. Through our public programming, we mobilize historical knowledge to address the challenges of the present. And tonight's event is the latest installment in our program series, Holocaust History on Film, Anne Frank and Beyond, which is part of our larger series, Anne Frank in History and Memory. Both are sponsored by and presented with Ancestry, the United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program, and Yeshiva University Museum. Our program series, Holocaust History on Film, goes beyond the exhibit, which I hope you've seen by now, on the life and death of Anne Frank to explore the evolution of Holocaust memory more broadly. And of course, this theme stands at the heart of tonight's screening of the classic film Gentleman's Agreement, which will be followed by a talkback with historian and CJH fellow Rachel Gordan, historian Avinoam Patt, and Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker Cecilia Peck, who of course is the daughter of the film's star, Gregory Peck. And I'd like to thank them all in advance for being with us this evening. We're going to get the film started right away, but please do keep an eye out for other upcoming events in our program series, Anne Frank in History and Memory. You can go to the CJH website and see what we have on tap for later this month. Without further ado, let's roll the film. Okay, we are going to proceed to our talkback. We'll try and take about 20-ish minutes to get the insights of our distinguished guests, who I'll introduce formally in a quick second. We will then, of course, open it up to audience Q&A. And I have a big smile on my face because I was smiling throughout the whole film, and I'd seen it once before in the 90s, and boy, I mean, it really holds up, and I think we all feel in various ways that what the film says to us today in 2025 and what it said to audiences in 1947, they may be similar, they may be different, but we'll have a lot of things to say. We have with us, I already alluded to our 3 distinguished guests earlier, but we have to my left Rachel Gordan. She is the NEH Public Scholars Fellow at the Center for Jewish History this whole year, where she is in fact working on a book about Laura Z. Hobson, the author of Gentleman's Agreement. She is a professor at the University of Florida, and her book, Post-War Stories, How Books Made Judaism American, is available here in Ruth's bookstore, currently closed, but please come back. And if you haven't been to Ruth's, it's only been open for a couple months, and it's been an enormous success, so I certainly welcome you to come visit. To her left is Cecilia Peck. She is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker, and of course, the daughter of Gregory Peck. She produced a documentary on her father. Extra applause, welcome, well-deserved. She produced a documentary entitled A Conversation with Gregory Peck, directed by Barbara Koppel, who is here as well. And her docu-series, Escaping Twin Flames, is currently streaming on Netflix. At my far left, Avinoam Patt is the Maurice and Corinne Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies, just down the street at NYU. He is also the Ingeborg H. and Ira Leon Renner Director of NYU's new Center for the Study of Antisemitism. He is the author of many books, some of which are also in Ruth's bookstore, so please, again, come visit. Okay, Rachel, let us begin with you. We've had a lot of opportunities in your months here at the center to talk about your ongoing project. And as I just mentioned, this remarkable film that we just saw is based on an equally important novel by Laura Hobson. What can you tell us about why Laura wrote the novel in the first place, and how did it reflect her own sense of identity in early post-war America?
The film is based on this best-selling novel, Gentleman's Agreement, which was first serialized in 1946, in the fall and winter of 1946, in Cosmopolitan magazine, and then was published as a book in February 1947, and then the movie came out in November of 1947. So it won Best Picture then in January of 1948. And Hobson wrote this in the 40s. She started writing it in 1944 because, like many Americans in the 40s, she was thinking a lot about anti-Semitism. With the war that Americans were fighting, there was a kind of reckoning with anti-Semitism that in some ways I think parallels the kind of reckoning we're having today, and which is part of the reason I think it still resonates so much with us. But she was also thinking about it because she was a Jew herself, which readers did not always realized that she had actually been born Laura Zemetkin, the daughter of Michael Zemetkin, who helped to found the Jewish Daily Forward, and her mother, Adela Keen Zemetkin, wrote a woman's column for another Yiddish paper. But she had married a non-Jewish publisher named Thayer Hobson and kept his last name, so that most readers were not aware or not sure that she was Jewish, and many wrote who were fans to her. They wrote and had letters that basically said, how wonderful is it that a non-Jew like you would be so morally outraged by anti-Semitism that you would write this novel, which was the kind of country she wanted to live in. That line we heard the editor, John Minifee, say when he says he wants the ad to read that religion is a matter of indifference to his magazine. That was Hobson's belief too. She wanted it not to matter what religion you were from. Religion had not mattered much to her. She grew up in a very secular home. She had tried to write about anti-Semitism before. She had a short story published in the New Yorker in the 1930s, and she was very evasive about anti-Semitism. The word anti-Semitism never appears, and she writes another essay about anti-Semitism after Charles Lindbergh makes his famous speech in September of 1941, where he blames Jews for trying to push the country into war. And she writes a really vehement essay, and she sends it to her good friend Henry Luce, who's publisher of Time, where she had worked for a while. And it's too strong for him to publish it. And so that struggle that we see Phil have over how do you write about anti-Semitism really mirrors her own struggle. And that question he has, how can I ask a Jew, what does this feel like? That would be such a rude question to try to ask my friend Dave Goldman, he realizes. Well, Hobson realizes the answer is literature. That is what a novel is supposed to do, bring us into the heart of another person. And so it's through that identification process that she lands on that Gentleman's Agreement is able to tell this story so powerfully.
So as the follow-up question, I think everyone's probably interested, what is the difference, if any, between the film and the novel?
The novel, of course, has a lot more interior monologue and backstory so that we hear more about Phil's marriage before his wife who had died. There's more about that brewing romance we see between Anne, the fashion editor, and Phil. And there's more about how Jews should not be thought of as a race. And to that end, Hobson includes some facts from her time. For instance, she has Phil give Kathy a brochure that I found in Hobson's collection in the archive, a brochure that some anthropologists had written during the 40s that explains to Americans that Jews are not members of a race. This is Nazi thinking. There's a number of scenes in the novels that really drill down on this lesson that we need to start talking about Jews as a religion. And she also has other scenes that the movie makers decided didn't work well, in a drama like this.
Cecilia, if we can turn to you for a brief second. I think probably a lot of people in the audience would be curious to hear about what, from your perspective, this film meant to your father, why he might have taken on the role in the first place, and maybe how he saw it as an important gesture cinematically to make, at this point in early post-war American history.
Yes, and first of all, just thank you so much for screening it and for inviting me and all of us here to speak about it. And And congratulations on your remarkable exhibit on Anne Frank. And to think that just 2 years before this film was made, she was in captivity and then captured and killed makes taking on this subject feel so important at that time. And I think my dad recognized that the film had the potential to address this sort of quiet anti-Semitism that he felt here in our country after the war. And he saw a kind of apathy towards it, that it was easier to just stay quiet or inert about it than fight it. And I think that was very disturbing to him. So he had already understood that films had the potential to make positive change and influence people's perceptions. And it came early on for him. He had only arrived in Hollywood 3 years earlier. He'd come from here, from New York, where he was at the Neighborhood Playhouse, and he started his career on Broadway. But pretty quickly, he was given parts that had a kind of, moral sense of justice to those roles. I think partly because of his physical presence. He was tall and he had that gorgeous voice, and he could take on those roles that aligned with his beliefs also. And he went on to, play many more of those parts and champion those kinds of films. I think by the time he did To Kill a Mockingbird 15 years later, he felt that he could bring even more complexity to the parts, but this, he felt very strongly about making this film. And maybe I could touch on his childhood a little to describe maybe how he became somebody with that kind of moral compass. He was born in La Jolla, California in 1916, a little tiny village. His dad was an Irish pharmacist. His mother was a telephone operator from St. Louis, Missouri. And his father was running the pharmacy during the Depression years when people often didn't have the money to pay for their medication, but my grandfather would fill their prescriptions nonetheless, which eventually caused the pharmacy to close, and his marriage broke up. But my father witnessed that sense of empathy and belief that nobody should be overlooked or excluded. So I think from very young, and he also described seeing the KKK marching in his hometown with their terrifying hats and burning crosses. So he grew up with an understanding of that prejudice and racism and discrimination existed, and I think it just became part of him to not only disagree with it, but to want to do something about it. So this was one of many films that he made that he believed could make a difference.
We all know, of course, that for so many important films, there's a complicated production history. And you could perhaps also tell us a little bit about the difficulties that this film had in getting made, especially with reference to 20th Century Fox and producer Darryl Zanuck. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Darryl Zanuck at Fox was the only studio he had willing to make this film. Interestingly, he was not Jewish, but he was appalled by the anti-Semitism in Hollywood and in the United States, and also by the other studios' reluctance to make the film. But my father had said that Louis B. Mayer at MGM had called up Zanuck when he heard that he was going to make the film and said, "Why would you do this?" And he very strongly tried to discourage him. He said, "The studio system is doing well, the film industry is booming. Why raise this controversial subject when we don't need to?" And I think he was also afraid of what it would look like for him not to have made it, if that would have implied that he was tacitly accepting anti-Semitism. So he was very against it, but Zanuck prevailed with my father's help, who was able to champion it in spite of his own agent, who discouraged him from doing it and said, "You're taking a big professional risk. Why would you do this?" But I am so proud of having a father who would.
Thank you so much for those insights. Avi, you're perhaps best positioned as a historian of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, to provide some clarity about the film's significance at the time it appeared in 1947. And so let me just give you a two-part question here, and you can give us your thoughts. Can one extrapolate from this particular film to something large about how Americans perceived anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath of World War II? And then, of course, perhaps the elephant in the room is the fact that we see soldiers, veterans from World War II. We know, of course, in the year 2025 what happened in World War II to the Jewish population, but there's no mention of the Holocaust in the film, and yet how can there not be the echoes of that event? So what does it say or not say about the impact of the Holocaust on American consciousness at this point in time?
Yeah, great.
Two
great
small
question.
questions.
Yeah, two small questions. Yeah, no, excellent. And first of all, let me thank you for organizing this and say what an honor it is to sit with Rachel and Cecilia. And thank you for sharing that background and context, both on the novel and the film, and about your father. So absolutely, as you frame the question, the elephant, so to speak, is this is 1947. We know that it's 2 years after the liberation of the camps. We see a GI in the shape of Dave Goldman, a Jewish GI in this in particular. This would have been sort of top of mind for most Americans at the time. I mean, even if there's sort of little knowledge, the prominence of the idea of why we fight, the notion of needing to fight to defeat Nazi Germany, to defeat fascism, to defend democracy, the images that might have come across in the newsreels about the shocking images related to the liberation of the camps. So it is remarkable, right, to see this film and to see that it's not there, right? And so then we have to think about when your first part of the question, which is what is anti-Semitism, or how is it defined within the context of this film? And it's really quite remarkable to think about what's the story that both Laura Hobson wants to tell, what's the story that Phil Green's character wants to tell about what is anti-Semitism within the American context, and how can Americans sort of be shaken out of the complacency of essentially decent people, which is one of the lines from the film, in terms of this is something that Americans can overcome, can conquer, but the way that it's represented is essentially sort of what we've defined as kind of a polite anti-Semitism, or a social anti-Semitism, one that we might see sort of not spoken out loud necessarily in a lot of contexts, but restrictions in hotels, restrictive covenants around housing, university quotas, medical schools are referred to a couple of times in the film, sort of these types of things that we might define as kind of social anti-Semitism. And yes, there is the name calling and sort of the use of slurs like kike, that kind of thing. But it is presented in such a way that it's quite striking to think about it in contrast to Nazi genocidal anti-Semitism, right? The notion of sort of an eliminationist anti-Semitism, the type of anti-Semitism that can lead to the extermination of European Jewry, almost as that's not something that would happen here in America. There is a very sort of triumphant narrative to a certain extent, right? Of we've just won the war. We can now go ahead and root out sort of those darkest parts of our society. We can face this head on. Jews are not that different from you and me. Gregory Peck can be cast as a Jew. Gregory Peck and Dave, we look the same, we talk the same, our mannerisms are not that different, right? Jews, it's just a matter of faith and belief, right? This idea of sort of, the way that it's explained to Tommy in the breakfast scene, right? There's Protestants, there's Catholics, there's Jews. We all have churches. We just pray a little bit differently in our churches, right? So this is very much this idea of sort of, that's what we're talking about tolerance, right? Understanding, building a society that's, that is committed to democratic ideals. But that is the type of anti-Semitism that we're thinking about in this context. And I just want to mention sort of as a second part of this, what I find quite striking that is presented in the film, and that Cecilia alluded to, is the Jewish responses to anti-Semitism, and how sort of Phil Green also addresses the notion of, and Dave also addresses the notion of how Jews should respond to anti-Semitism, right? And what Laura Hobson is trying to do in terms of thinking about how Jews should respond to anti-Semitism. So you have the studio executives like Louis B. Mayer, perhaps represented in The Industrialist in the lunchtime conversation. Let us handle it our own way, right? The quiet hush-hush way as it's defined. And there is this idea of, no, we have to face this head on. We have to fight it, right? And you can see that tension that's played out about what is the best way to respond to anti-Semitism? What's the best way to fight it? And I would say that we still, right, to a certain extent, grapple with that tension of, is it something that should be called out loud? Is it just something that is a specifically Jewish problem? Is it something that affects sort of democratic societies, that we have to build alliances with all minority groups to fight for sort of the type of society that we'd like to see together? Even the question of Zionism comes up in the film, right? And this Einstein-like character, I love the casting there of the Professor Lieberman, right? Where he's wrestling with the idea of, like, what is a Jew? Is a Jew a nation? Is a Jew a race? Is a Jew a religion? But it comes up in subtle ways in the film. And so it is, I just want to say, it's a remarkable film because, I mean, here we are 80 years basically later, and this is a classic. A classic is something that withstands the test of time, right? I think Rachel and I talked about this. We can show this to our students, and there is so much that they pull out of this film that it is. So it's really quite remarkable. So thank you for screening it.
We're going to open it up to audience Q&A. Before we do, there is somebody in the audience I hope that we'd like to recognize. Cecilia, would you do the honors?
May I? Well, we'd like to know if Christopher Hart is here. Are you here? Christopher, will you raise your hand? If so, we were hoping that the great Moss Hart's son would be joining us. He wrote the screenplay, but I'm not sure if Chris is here. No? All right.
The name was on the registration list, so we wanted to throw the opportunity out there if you were here that you could also provide some insights. But in any case, please, Julie has the microphone. If you want to raise your hand, we'll be happy to bring the mic over and you can ask your question. Over here. Oh, thanks, Trey.
Hi, my name is Lauren Lokshan. I'm very pleased to know Rachel and to meet all of you tonight. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom about this remarkable film. My question actually emanates from a point, which is that Laura Hobson comes up with an extravagant contrivance in developing the plot of this film. As a Jewish author, imagining a Protestant protagonist who pretends himself to be Jewish so that he can excavate the minds and cultural lives and interactions of non-Jews thinking about Jews. And I'm wondering how much the success of this film and the novel and the ideas propagated by this film relies on the protagonist being non-Jewish. Do Jews have less status in combating anti-Semitism than non-Jews? How much of the success of this argument that anti-Semitism is anti-American relies on it being a non-Jewish white Protestant male making that claim? Thanks.
Rachel, you want to start with that one?
Yes, thank you, Lauren, for that question. I think that it is really the key to the novel and the film's success. Hobson was writing at a time when Jews were often seen as too impartial, too non-objective. They were labeled as engaged in special pleading, even though today this seems natural to us that people would want to fight on behalf of their own groups. And so having her main character be a non-Jew did make it easier for the non-Jewish majority to identify. And then having, such a admired, handsome actor as Gregory Peck play the part made it all the more powerful. So I think it was kind of genius because through Phil Green and Gregory Peck, she was modeling in our terms today what it meant to be an ally to Jews. And also in that reaction we see from Phil at the end of the film, we heard Anne, the fashion editor saying to him, I was wondering how you got so juiced up every time, recognizing that a Jew, an adult Jew, would not be able to be that outraged every time. But what Phil is modeling is this sort of indignant, righteous indignation, moral outrage, and Hobson and the actors are showing this should be our response as Americans, but a Jew couldn't model that realistically. So in all sorts of ways, including for the novel and the film not to be labeled as just a Jewish novel or just a Jewish story, I think it really worked to have this be about a non-Jew. It's the same reason, though, that the novel and the film are criticized in later decades as Americans start to feel that a Jew really should get to tell his own story. We now have a lot more of a robust conversation about who gets to tell whose story. But at this time, in its time, I think it actually made a lot of sense.
You want to add?
If I could add, and I think it's an excellent question, because this is very much sort of what I think Laura Hobson is trying to, the point that she's trying to make, that this is a fight that somebody like Gregory Peck has to pick up and sort of assist Jews. It's not going to make a difference if John Garfield makes the point. It's got to be Gregory Peck that makes the point. But one of the things that I think is so interesting in terms of the context is that if we think about sort of why America got into World War II, right, that sort of isolationism that was so prominent, that was trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, the Lindbergh, the sort of America first mentality, right? It was incredibly difficult for FDR even to make the case that the United States should get into the war. And then this idea that this should not be seen as a war that's being fought for Jews or a war that's being fought to save Jewish lives. It's a war to defend and protect democracy and fight against fascism. And so I think to a certain extent, you still see that being played out in this immediate post-war period, right? That again, right, it's like, this is a cause that Americans have to fight for. This is not something that Jews, right? We're not picking up this fight just because Jews want us to pick up this fight.
Thank you so much for all of this. So Mosshart's son is not speaking. Is there something you'd like to say about his relationship to this film, how he came to write it, what he thought about it?
Are you Chris?
I am not even close to Chris.
Well, I was hoping that Chris would speak about his father's courage and what writing the film meant to him, and just to express admiration, because I think Hollywood was very much shying away from films about anti-Semitism and controversial subjects. So I was hoping to hear what Chris's recollections were.
I know that Mosshart responded really positively to the novel. And they had, actually, Daryl Zanuck was first thinking of two women, Claire Luce, who was a friend of Laura Z. Hobson's, and was married to Henry Luce, not Jewish, and also the playwright Lillian Hellman. But they ended up deciding neither of those seemed right. And then Mosshart, everyone was delighted once he was on board. He just hadn't been the first thought, and he was really a fan of Hobson's novel.
Julie, want to go?
I'd just like to make a comment about Gregory Peck, which probably very few people here are aware of. There's a movie from the 1960s titled Mirage. I think a wonderful movie. I've seen it 3 times. Never met anyone else who saw it.
Can you just speak into the mic?
Yeah, it stars Gregory Peck in Mirage, and it's a murder mystery. The murder has been malfeasance by a corporation, really. It's a sort of left-wing movie. And there's a witness who Gregory Peck comes to discover is a witness to the murder, but who refuses to talk. And in the last scene of the movie, Peck, whose voice, I assume everyone in here recognizes Gregory Peck's voice.
Hold the mic close, very close to your mouth, please.
Gregory Peck's Gregory Peck, the character he's playing, says, "You've got to declare. You've got to take a stand. You've got to declare." And the witness at the end says, "Yes, that's the murderer." And I just think that says something about your father.
Well, thank you for bringing up Mirage. It's, as you said, a lesser-known film, but yes, he always. I mean, those characters were close to him, and I think that's why he was so believable. And he said it was harder to play the good guys than the bad guys because it was more difficult to give them complexity and make them interesting. But he managed to do that over and over.
My name is Ron Schechter, and I want to thank you for the presentation. I have a question for each of you. One is an author of a book, one is in the film industry, and one is a historian. How would you use this film and book as a vehicle or a tool to combat anti-Semitism today?
Avi, you want to start?
So so I do use this in class, and so a couple of thoughts about this. There was a class that I did when I was at the University of Connecticut, and now we do this class at NYU. And for the period on sort of American anti-Semitism, we assign this film. And one of the things that I want the students to think about is, first of all, actually Gav's question about sort of types of anti-Semitism, right? So what is defined here again, and we said sort of social or polite anti-Semitism. But one of the other things that's sort of the next level of thinking about this is, how do you use popular culture or media as part of this struggle against, right? Rachel and I were talking about anti-Semitism, right? Like, what are the most effective tools? And so clearly there's a belief in this film that not only, right, can you expose it, can you use the press, can you use media to expose and sort of educate people about the dangers of it, but also that the film industry, right, like that's the meta part of this, the film industry has a role to play in this. And as I'm watching this, I'm still thinking about, and we actually, in the NYU class, we had students last week it was the end of the class, that was a half semester. We had them analyze ads that the American Jewish Committee had done in the 1950s on sort of advertisements that would have appeared, I guess, on television, short videos. You can actually see it at the American Jewish Historical Society, the AJC here, fighting against, but it was about America as a baseball team, and we all have to work together, and we have to promote ideals of tolerance, and different people from different backgrounds, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, can all work together, right? So it's of this moment. And then we had them compare it to like the Bob Kraft Super Bowl ads. Because there's still this belief, right, of like, do you combat anti-Semitism? Do you combat hate? How do you get people to combat hate? So those are some of the ways, like, to get them to think about how to use that.
Who else would like to weigh in next?
I also teach the novel and the film in my classes at the University of Florida, where I have mostly non-Jews in my students, but also some Jews. And it is just interesting to see that I think it is still the case that my students are better able to relate to this because it's not just about Jews, and there's something very realistic about this love story, especially that date scene we saw where things start to cool between Phil and Kathy when she hears the angle and realizes she might have to tell people she's dating a Jew. And I often have my students write, trying to write a contemporary version of some of these scenes because it is so realistic, and because it is about this nonviolent anti-Semitism that we compare to microaggressions today, that level of prejudice or discrimination that many students are aware they experience in their own lives around different identity issues. So in other words, we read parts of it, we watch parts of it, and we sort of compare it to our own experiences today.
I think one other thing maybe that's worth pointing out is that this film really does tease out how emotionally grueling it is just to go through and endure what sounds minor social anti-Semitism, because of course we know about how much worse things were in Europe in the 1940s, but for people to even understand that the more mild forms of anti-Semitism can be incredibly stress-inducing. That's one of the things I think the film does very well. There were some other, I don't remember who's next, Trey or Julie, maybe Julie on your side. Is there anyone who? Okay, I think Trey, we can go back here.
I was born in a refugee camp, and as a preteen, I came across Gregory Peck on television. And the films that I saw, Gentleman's Agreement, which I've seen numerous times, but not in a while, Keys of the Kingdom, where he plays a very earnest person of faith. And then as a teenager, when I went to see To Kill a Mockingbird, the integrity and the humanity of your father has stayed with me my entire life. And I'm very grateful to see this film on a large screen and see it again, especially where we are in 2025. And I had forgotten how much of a romance the film was. And the tenderness and the humanity and the compassion in the relationship between Philip and his mother. There's just an integrity in the film that crosses boundaries and really speaks to a human experience. That's all.
Cecilia, any thoughts about either the comments or Keys to the Kingdom and how that film fits into what we've been discussing?
I think I would just say that in this internet age where the voices of hatred are so amplified, it's just so important to have these voices in films that combat injustice and that speak to, tolerance.
For Rachel, maybe, and Cecilia a little bit. John Garfield was Julius Garfinkel. What do you know anything that making this film meant to him and gave power to his scenes? And he had that, like late in the film, that long scene with her in the booth. That was pretty, that's a little bit novel for the main character to not be in such a strong scene.
I know that he was a fan of the novel and that Hobson originally wanted a non-Jew to play that part because it was part of her whole philosophy that, a Jew should be able to play a non-Jew, sort of the right back and forth. And I'll just add there, she herself was sort of passing as a non-Jew. She never denied she was Jewish, Laura Z. Hobson, that is, but she was aware that most people didn't know she was Jewish. So this theme of passing is one that comes from her own life. And that scene at the end between Dave and Kathy is something that she and Moss Hart worked on together because they were having trouble sort of getting to the end. How do we move Kathy towards becoming an anti-Semitic person? Because it wasn't that much before that scene where we might think she was a real anti-Semite based on some of the things she was saying.
I just know that my dad called John Garfield an actor's actor and loved working with him and thought he was one of the greats.
I'll just add one thing, because I'm really glad that you mentioned, right, Julius Garfinkel. And yeah, no. But I think that hints at a very important phenomenon, which is the idea of name changing, which is so crucial to the film and the plot of the film also, right? Greenberg, Garfinkel, Garfield, right? And sort of to be a leading man in Hollywood at the time, even though you have sort of the Jewish studio moguls, right? For the actors, they still have to change their names, right? They have to, to a certain extent, conceal their identities. And this idea of Jews needing to change their names, or the Miss Wales in The Office to gain entry, right? Like, this is a very prominent theme. So I find it fascinating that is playing out in the film as well. Like, I'm happy that it ended up being John Garfield who was cast in the film, because then you can see it happening on a number of levels. And then, Dara Horn writes about this in People Love Dead Jews, the idea that sort of what are the stories that then Jews told themselves about why they changed their names. And that it's not necessarily the idea of like Ellis Island and the name being changed there, but a conscious choice to de-Judaize your name in order to gain entry into society, right? How do you explain that to your children? And then I'll just say, sort of there's a sad kind of postscript to the John Garfield story, which is that essentially not long after this, actually in 47 or in the same time, we were just looking this up before, House Un-American Affairs Committee starts to become very active. A number of the actors, in Hollywood, they're trying to get people to name names, communists. Garfield gets called to appear before, and I think he dies of a heart attack quite tragically young. I can't remember exactly what year, if it's 48, 49, but that's sort of a sad postscript to the film.
I just have a brief anecdote to share on the matter of names and passing. Last year I was leaving work, where, as you may know, I'm the president of the Center for Jewish History. I'm leaving work, going to the Union Square subway, and the Chabadniks are there, and the mitzvah mobile, and they want to know, do I want to do a bracha? And he said, the guy comes up to me, he's like, are you Jewish? So I take out my card, says Gavriel Rosenfeld, President, Center for Jewish History, and I give it to him. And he looks at it and he says, yeah, but are you Jewish? So I would think my name, Gavriel Rosenfeld, would give me away, but no, it wasn't enough. And I don't know if that's the inverse of passing or something to that effect, but such as New York City, which, by the way, I think we all can agree is the co-star of the film in all the views from the city in the early or mid-1940s. Question over here. And I think we'll take a couple more and then call it a wonderful night.
This question is directed to the historians, because we've looked at this film and moved forward from 1947 to 2025 and everything in the middle. Can you reflect back as Passover is approaching and there's early anti-Semitism, maybe the first anti-Semitism recorded in history of the slavery of the Jews, and this is the holiday of their exodus and their freedom?
Rich, you want to start us off on what the film tells us about today? Can we learn anything about today from 1947's reflections?
Well, the film did provoke a lot of conversation in 1947 and 1948 about this issue of, do Jews really have to be just like everyone else to gain acceptance? Because that seemed like the message that Phil Green was sending, that because he looks like Dave, he could be a Jew, and he would be the kind of Jew that Dave is. This idea that we should be sort of interchangeable and the religion doesn't go that deep. That was coming from Hobson's own life, because she was not a religious person. She didn't think religion was important. So in the wake of the film's success, Life magazine, other popular magazines had these stories about sort of the problems with this portrayal of anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism. And it was a positive development, because it got people to realize there's a problem with this argument for tolerance, that we should let Jews be distinctive and different, and they shouldn't have to look just like Gregory Peck to gain other Americans' acceptance. So I think even though the film has that message of sameness, which is not so acceptable to us today, by putting that out there, it provoked more thoughtful responses on anti-Semitism that I think sort of lead us more to where we are today in terms of thinking that Jews should be able to be their own unique selves.
Yeah, so I'll just circle back to the question about sort of thinking about where we are in 2025, 80 years after, but also thinking about Passover approaching next week. I'm impressed that so many people are out, not cleaning or doing shopping or doing whatever. But the idea of the themes that are, I think the question was asking us to think about the themes that are reflected in the Haggadah, for example, the ideas that and how they connect to what we see in the film or what we think about today. So, of course, I go to the idea of sort of what we read every year, right? That Bechol Dor Vador, in every generation, one should see themselves as if they too, emerged from slavery. And this idea of like how do we understand this type of persecution, this type of discrimination that's represented in the film? Do we see this as sort of like a timeless, recurring theme that in every place that Jews find themselves, they face this type of discrimination, they face this type of dilemma? There, as we read the Haggadah, and you'll, for those of you who are observing Passover on the Seders on Saturday and Sunday night, you'll read the Haggadah and you'll see certain themes that I think will connect, right? There are themes about assimilation. There are themes about power. There are themes about sort of what is the proper response. There are themes about, I'm thinking about ideas of servitude, liberation, sort of the festival of freedom, what that means right now. But at the same time, right, I think we don't want to just look for sort of the themes that repeat over and over, because that is a very common sort of Jewish approach to think about, okay, this is in every generation, or it's like the summary of every Jewish holiday, right? They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, like that summary. But actually, we can see that it's much more complicated and specific to look at the specific sort of themes that are presented in post-war America in 1947 that are actually quite different from some of the themes that we're seeing today. I mean, when I think about what I see in this film is America won the war, we can defeat this, we can go into a better future. Phil's mom says, I want to live to see that tomorrow. And it's a very triumphant narrative of this is going to be a century of all, 20th century, of all humans uniting and conquering all of these things together, right? Like that's the message that she says. And now we're here in the 21st century, and things aren't playing out exactly as, fortunately, Phil's mom is not here anymore, so she isn't seeing this. But it does like show us that the struggle continues, right? In every generation. We have to rise up and fight against these things and form alliances and work together with other groups and continue to fight to defend what this democracy is supposed to be about, right?
Perhaps if we can have one last question, and if we want to if there's another one that we will cluster in with that, then we'll call it a night. I think, sir, you have the last word.
Thank you. I was thinking B'chol Dor also, and the themes that begin in the film lay the groundwork for what I'm seeing by watching social media every day and being very involved in what's going on, especially in New York City, that there are Jewish influencers who dress like Hamas supporters standing in Washington Square to solicit comments from people walking through that as Jews or Israelis, they would not be able to ascertain. So the theme of pretending to find the truths or to speak to the truths. And also I thought the professor, the scientist character is a character I encounter every day because so many Jews are doing a tap dance to become defensive of our position as Jews and Zionists, and not also wanting to relate to the bad parts of that today. So there is a tap dance about the religion, the culture, the race, and the peopledom of Israel that gets spoken to every day. And I thought that his comment was so profoundly timely.
So would anyone either like to respond to the question or final thoughts about this evening's film, or both, or neither? If you want to start us off,
I'll start with the question, and then we can do final thoughts. I mean, I do think like one of the things, so both parts, so 47, so it is remarkable to like think about the film coming out in 1947. So we have the Lieberman character, but it's before the creation of the State of Israel. And does the character in the novel say something similar? Yeah, very like basically the same idea. So there is kind of a nod then to this idea of what Zionism represents, but even I think as you're hinting at, it's sort of, maybe it's supposed to be like an Einstein type joke, I don't know, but like a circular logic that then kind of falls apart upon itself, that it's confused about what it actually means to be a Jew. But one of the things that's striking, right, is that the film exists before Israel. And so that is one of the things that, is completely different in the world. We live in a world where Israel exists, right? So it is a complete game changer in that regard in terms of how we think about identity. What's remarkable, though, to think about is what this would have meant at the time for American Jews, right? Where there's not sort of a consensus in 47, when the State of Israel is created and Ben-Gurion has to negotiate an arrangement with Jacob Blaustein about basically, please support our project, but we're not going to try to force your children to make Aliyah, right? Like that is sort of the arrangement that's made. We can think about it. I think we've come, there's been a huge change in terms of the attitudes of American Jews to what Israel means to them from the time that's represented in the film. And then I'll just say about the sort of social media influencers, again, just in a word, it is quite remarkable to think about sort of the power of media to shape minds. And in some ways, right, the moving image can be very powerful. It's maybe not so different from what we're seeing today about how people use media to shape minds as well.
Cecilia, any concluding thoughts, or even maybe if I could throw out a speculative question, what would your dad either be thinking about our conversation right now, knowing that 80 years later, the work remains as powerful as it is, or what he would say about the present world we're living in?
Well, I think he, the film won the Oscar for Best Picture. We should mention that. So I think he realized that the faith he had in the film was how the audience understood and appreciated it, and he was also nominated for Best Actor. So I think he was grateful that the film was able to accomplish what it did. As far as, my father was very opposed to violent means of resolving conflict. He was always in favor of dialogue and understanding. I think he'd be grateful that it's being shown and spoken about today. One observation I had was, didn't everyone want him to end up with Celeste Holm and not with Dorothy McGuire? And I'm not sure, Rachel, on whether in the book he does does he end up with Kathy? He does. Well, that's another interesting discussion.
It's an opportunity for fan fiction.
And I just am so interested to hear Rachel and Avi speak about the historical context, and I think I'm more here to maybe bring my dad to life for us. And I guess I would just say that scene when he comforts his son reminds me very much of how he was as a father to us, and that kind of combination of tenderness and empathy, but also having a moral spine was what I grew up with, and the kind of parent I try to be to my children.
Rachel, it's been great having you here all year working on this project with source material that is held here in the archives. Perhaps you can take the last word for the evening.
Yeah, hearing Cecilia speak about her father reminds me when I was reading the reviews from 1947 and 1948, how popular these actors like Gregory Peck, like Jimmy Stewart, like Gary Cooper, who portrayed that moral compass, integrity, American values. This was before actors like James Deans were popular and that culture of rebellion. Instead, it was all about this kind of dignity. And the reviews really felt like that was what made the film so powerful, and that it did great glory to the movie industry. As Avi mentioned before, in a way, Gentleman's Agreement is much more about America than about Jews. That line that Dave Goldman makes when he says, "I'm on the sidelines of this," that was Hobson's feeling. In this country, the majority culture, the non-Jews, has to care, has to be the ones who want to fight for something to really change. And so she never felt herself to be writing a Jewish book. In fact, when the Jewish Book Council wanted to award her the National Book Award, she declined it. She would come to regret that at the end of her life in the 1980s. But at this time, she really felt she was writing about America.
Please give a round of applause to our guests. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please go on our website to see what other events we have in store for everyone later this month. Thank you again, and good night.